And joining us now is Esme Fuller-Thomson, Professor of Social Work at the University of Toronto. We're grateful you came into TVO today.
Thanks for having me.
Let's just start by doing some comparison because, of course, the baby boomers are supposedly on the verge of retiring, or at least the retirement age anyway. The generation before the boomers, what did they do when their parents got older?
Well, their parents would have lived with them, or they've lived with their parents, because if they're in an agricultural society, the parents owned the land. So if you think back to the Waltons,
the television show.
Yeah, right. It was the grandparents' farm, and the kids moved in, and the 7 grandchildren, etc. So it was very common to live with your adult children and grandchildren. I think about 60% of older adults lived with adult children in 1900.
So this group is going to do it very differently, obviously, because they're not all living together in the same place.
Yeah, but some of that's by choice, because people are financially much better off. Older adults are not nearly as poor as they used to be. We've made significant gains with Canadian pension plan and old age security and guaranteed income supplement. And older adults are choosing not to live with their adult children. They have options, and they may make those options to be close, but not necessarily in the same place.
Not that close.
Yeah.
Okay, but again, going back decades again, what would happen if, you know, mom had a stroke and she needed extra care or attention back then?
Well, there were very few options. That was the other thing. You either lived with your children, or there were very few long-term care homes, kind of nursing homes. So typically the spouse would be the first line of attack for protection, but usually when the widowed mom is left behind, it would be the adult children that would pitch in. And of course there were more children to pitch in to help too.
No, that's a good point, right, yeah. Everybody had bigger families back then. So would it sort of automatically be incumbent upon, I guess, children first, then grandchildren after that, to take care of grandma or grandpa?
I think that was the expectations, and even now, you know, people are pitching in. It's just that they have more options available to how they choose to arrange that living arrangement or whatever.
Does it go without saying, Esme, that daughters pitched in more than sons?
Of course, and still does. About 3/4 of caregivers are female. Now the sons do some things, but the sons are more likely to purchase care or to do the outdoor care, the actual hands-on helping mom, you know, do the day-to-day tasks, feeding mom, those types of things. If they were severely disabled, tends to go to daughters, and then also daughters-in-law pitch in a great deal as well.
Well, I guess that probably makes sense because I guess, you know, older mother doesn't necessarily want younger son bathing her or doing some of those other less comfortable things.
I'm sure that's it, but also historically women were not as much in the workplace, so they had a little more time as well. And women have been caregivers forever with respect to their children, so going up the ladder isn't that much different than going down with respect to that.
Sure. Somewhat broader question though. We're obviously all living longer these days on average, so how are these additional years changing how families begin to look at caring for older people?
Yeah, you know, in 1950, the average man died at 66. So they retired, they had 1 year. Caregiving wasn't really an issue.
That's 1950.
That's not that long
ago. Not that long ago.
And now the average man's 12 years later. So not all of those years are healthy years. Many are. But healthcare's improved so much that you don't die of a heart attack as much as you used to, or a stroke. You know, you may have 1 or 2 or 3 years of severe disabilities afterwards. And those are what we're talking about here. How do we figure out a really healthy way of providing good care and keeping the family functioning as a unit?
Let's do some of this by the numbers here. We've got some numbers from Investors Group. And this is boomer caregivers 43 to 63 years old. This is in Canada. 69% have at least one living parent or parent-in-law. Of this group, a little over a third providing some form of care for aging parents. And of these caregivers, check this out, caregivers on average are traveling 225 kilometers a month to do their thing and devoting on average 42 hours a month. Now that's what the Investors Group numbers say. You've done your research also. How well does this poll represent the reality of those caring for elderly parents?
To me, those numbers seemed a little high, and I noticed that it came out of Winnipeg. So if you're in a more rural province where your families are living 100, 200 kilometers out of Winnipeg, then maybe that's some of the high numbers. A lot of caregiving is fairly modest. The adult is taking care of extra details, helping mom go to do her shopping while she's still living independently. I mean, if you're looking at people over 85, still a third of women over 85 are living by themselves in the community. So they're doing pretty well, but they might need help with their taxes or help with lawn care or those types of things. But once something serious happens, you break a hip, you have a stroke, that's when the more intense caregiving steps in, and or long-term care options are considered.
Okay, let's humor me for a second, and let's assume that 225 kilometers a month is, you know, ballpark.
Yeah.
How are these greater distances that we're living from our parents affecting the way we're able to care for them?
Well, that's a real issue. I live 200 kilometers from my mom, and my mother-in-law's in British Columbia, both widowed and doing amazingly well. But I'd love to be able to check in on them. I'd like to be able to take them to doctor's appointments, and that's not really that feasible with 4 kids and a 4-hour commute going there and back.
You've got the 4 kids,
I've got the 4 kids, yeah, not her. So the question is, how do you do those day-to-day tasks that might be easier if you lived in a small town historically and you could just go down the street? But I grew up in a small town, and nobody of my generation's left there. It's really, everybody's moved to the city, and we're all living far from our parents. So that's a big change, probably since the 1950s, that people have tended to be more mobile than they had been historically.
Would you say that you are, because your mother lives so far away, maybe you're not in this situation, but we hear all the time about the sandwich generation. They're dealing with their own children, but they also have much more significant caregiving responsibilities to their parents. How prevalent is that nowadays?
Well, for my own case, my mother's still doing 20 hours of volunteer work a week, and she comes up and babysits for my kids.
So she's fine.
I'm fine on that front. I think my generation's having their kids a bit later. So it is possible, if you have your kids at 40, to be having a mom who's 70 needing a little bit of assistance or more assistance. So that possibility exists, but we have fewer children than we did in the 1950s generation. Might have had 4 or 5 children, and so they were caregiving over a longer period of time for their own kids. So I don't know if it's going up or it's going down, but it's certainly, the people who are caught in the middle feel it.
Yeah, maybe it's because this generation tends to complain a little more than perhaps the tougher generation, the greatest generation ever did. But I do seem to anecdotally hear a lot about getting stretched in every direction, and particularly women nowadays. Yeah. They've got their own children to take care of. They've got maybe ailing parents to take care of, and many of them obviously work outside the home as well. I mean, that's a prescription for a fairly tough life, is it not?
Well, it certainly adds stress, but I think what you're also emphasizing is that people have a sense that they have this responsibility, whether they're doing every day-to-day task or if they're overseeing, kind of managing the care. People are very connected. The 3 generations, the grandkids are involved with the grandparents and the parents, and so we're trying to make it work.
And that's good, you thought.
And I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And we have this problem because people are living longer. That's also a good thing, right? It's just, how do we manage it best, and what kind of policies could we put in place to provide a little more assistance, like flexible time from work would make a huge difference. Part-time options, or being able to leave early, go late, make sure you make that doctor's appointment, you get your mom to the specialist, you don't want her to drive there, all of those things.
Well, what prevents all of that from happening?
I think there's a little bit of public inertia. I would hope that we're starting to think. The numbers are such that, we're all going to be dealing with this soon enough, so let's start thinking proactively about what would a workplace look like that was conducive to elder care as well as child care. We're starting to think about child care, so this is the next step down the road.
We've got a graph here that shows the average persons per family in Canada going back to the Roaring 20s and then towards today. And this will come as no shock to anybody with that little bulge in 1961 there, baby boomers, and then, the line is just trending down, down, and down. And the boomers, presumably, will have fewer and fewer people to tend to them as they get into those years where they're going to need more and more help. And I wonder what you think the implications are for them when that happens.
Well, I think the emphasis is for us as a nation to think about investing now, because right now the people 85 and up, that's the age group that needs the extra assistance mostly. They tend to be the parents of the boomers, so we have 2 or 3 siblings to share this with. But we're not going to have the same opportunities. Lots of people have no children, 1 child, 2 children, and the options are much fewer with respect to staying for long-term care in the community unless we put more supports in. So somebody checking in daily, or these emergency alarm bracelets that they have that you can press a button if you fall. Those
really
types
work?
of things.
That stuff really work?
They really work.
It does, eh?
They're fantastic. Just they work in that they decrease my level of stress as an adult child, the older adults' level of stress, and it just makes it a safer place to stay in the community. So there are some good resources. It looks a little bit different, though, if you have Alzheimer's or dementia. That's a much harder profile to take care of.
How many? You're one of how many siblings?
5.
You're one of 5. That's really rare today, isn't it? Very unusual.
Very rare.
So this next generation coming up underneath us, it's going to be a lot more focus on, you know, the 1 or 2 kids that.
Or no kids.
Or no kids.
Or no kids is the real issue. Huh. So the government's got to step in and provide some extent of social support in the community. And there are some creative things that have been done. It's just there's long wait lists, and the numbers of older adults, you know, the tidal wave's coming. So we need to be working on this now.
Let me ask you about the cultural angle on this, because of course if we were having this conversation a century ago, we'd be talking only about Anglo-Saxon people, you know, in the main. Now, of course, it's a fantastically multicultural society, and I wonder, do different cultures handle this differently in our society now?
Well, if you look internationally, in Japan, 65% of older adults still live with their adult child. And in Italy, it's like 39%. So even though I haven't seen the studies in Canada, I would guess that particularly if the older adult is of an immigrant generation, the norms within the families will be slightly different because they're coming from a different sort of normative home community. So some cultures are more receptive to 3-generational living, and some are less.
But the 45-year-old Italian male who's single and still living with mom and having her do his laundry, even when she's 90, that's not changing, eh?
Yeah, well, they're still co-resident. Who's caring it for who is another question,
Co-resident,
right?
That's a nice way to put it.
Yes.
Okay, let's talk assisted living here. What are the options for someone who needs assistance, but, as we suggested, doesn't have the child who can, say, move in with them to help, or, conversely, doesn't want that child to move in and wants to live independently?
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Well, if you're moving independently, and you want to continue to live independently, there's some great options, but the trouble is it's a little hard to find them. So Ontario's developed this one-stop shopping place called the Community Care Access Centres.
CCACs.
CCACs.
Yep.
And they're wonderful. Literally, there's one in every community. I put up on the website a link so that people can figure out how to get into them. And they're the people you contact to say, I need more help at home, or I'm thinking about long-term care options. What do I have? And they'll come to your house. They'll connect you with support groups. As somebody with early Alzheimer's, you might want to go to a support group. As a caregiver, you might want to go to a support group. All of those resources are out there, but you just have to, you know, make that phone call.
Got it. I don't know if you saw this piece that Jonathan Rauch did in Atlantic Magazine, but it was, it was a really touching piece on how he was now in a situation where he had to care for an elderly father during the last few years of life, and I'm just going to read an excerpt from it. I did go on, says Jonathan, but I emerged from the whole experience not a little indignant. The medical infrastructure for elder care in America is good, very good, but the cultural infrastructure is all but non-existent. How can it be that so many people like me are so completely unprepared for what is, after all, one of life's near certainties? You want to try taking a stab at that?
You know, I think we're as a culture, we're not that comfortable talking about death.
Boy, isn't that
illness,
an understatement?
decline.
Not that comfortable talking about it?
And I know you're doing a whole week on it.
Yeah.
Bless your heart. That's wonderful to get that news out. But so people aren't really speaking day to day about, I need these responsibilities. It's okay in my workplace to say, oh, I've got to run home, I've got childcare responsibilities. But you don't hear people disclosing as much about, oh, you know, my dad's got dementia and I've got to be spending a lot of time there, or helping my mom out, or, you know, those types of things.
Why would that be? I mean, you're right. We don't have any problem saying, I got to run, go pick up my kids from school. Why would we have a problem saying, I got to take off an hour to go take my dad to the doctor?
I don't know. I don't think it's publicly acceptable at the moment. But I would love that to change, because we're all in it together, right?
How do you make that change?
Thanks for offering this television show. That's a start. You know, the discussion has to be out there. And from this article, he began to realize that that tons of his peers were doing the same thing, but it's just, It's just they weren't talking about it. It wasn't out there. So it's a matter of the media promoting it, and I think workplaces have to be creative. Often the government should take a lead in thinking about elder care as an option. Can we give you some temporary unpaid leave around elder care issues or palliative care issues? You know, we can think a little more creatively than we do already.
How much of this is wrapped up in the general discomfort many men have talking about these touchy-feely things with other men to begin with?
Well, you know what? I have.
Is that too leading a question?
I think that it's a generic problem, because I don't hear people in my women's book club saying that this is a real issue for them, even though I know that they're doing these tasks.
So women don't talk about this stuff either?
I don't think so, to a huge degree. But then a lot of us aren't doing the really chronic, very time-consuming caregiving that goes with dementia or an advanced stroke. A lot of us are just doing a couple hours a week of helping people who are frail but aging well in place. So not everybody's in that situation, I guess, is part of it.
And in our last minute here, how much of this is wrapped up in the, you know, the lack of willingness for elder parent not to be parented by their children? You know, which is basically what happens at this stage in life, right? Your kids become your parents become, in some respects, your kids.
Well, there are all kinds of options. For example, you can make a living will, which is just saying, this is the type of care I want to have if I can't express my wishes. That's a great thing to do. Go ahead, do it, guys.
Parents and adult children do that
No,
together.
the parents can do it, and then the adult children, they have their script. They can go ahead, and you don't have to discuss, I think mom would want this, I think mom would want that kind of thing. You certainly can give the direction, and typically the adult child will do their best to follow that wish.
Gotcha. Esme Fuller-Thomson from the Social Work Department at University of Toronto. Thanks so much for visiting us today at TVO.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.